Hey everyone, welcome in. We're so excited for you to join us today. Um, just a couple things as we get started today. We just wanted to say thank you for joining, but we also really want to know what got you interested in the topic and what you're curious about. So if you're joining today, if you can pop into the comments, what about the topic got you interested? If you have questions, we'd love to see them. A few agreements before we get into the good stuff is to stay curious. So Betty and I both believe that there's no right or wrong perspective, that this is just a way to see things and we are presenting a certain perspective. So if something resonates, add that in the comments. If something doesn't, we'd really love to see that in the comments. If you're just like, no, that doesn't work for me, or if you just have a general challenge, I think that's good for us to see, as well as just start broader conversation amongst those that are joining today. And if you hear something and you want some accountability and you want to put into the comments that you're setting a goal or something for yourself and you just want someone else to see it or Betty and I to see it, we would love to hear about that as well. And Betty and I both we agree to stay open and we ask that those who join do the same thing. We see this as a part of a larger journey. And we both really like to say, take what you need, leave what you don't. And that just, depending on the kind of day or week you're having, there will be some stuff that resonates and some stuff that doesn't. And I think that's okay. So before we get started, we do want to introduce ourselves. I'm Ashmi Patel. I'm a life coach for ADHD women. And when people usually say, tell me a little bit about yourself, I've kind of got it down to a nutshell sentence. And I say, I'm wildly curious, easily excitable, a deep feeler, and a constant daydreamer. I feel like that kind of sums up what I'm about and what I kind of spend my time doing. Like I said, I'm a life coach for undiagnosed and late diagnosed ADHD women, and I help women break free from survival mode, a lifetime of burnout, overwhelm, and help them get closer to a life that has more ease, more space, and choice. And I like to say I'm about soft accountability and slow journeys. So I'm not the coach that's going to give you tough love. Most of the people that I come across and almost all of the people I work with are already extremely hard on themselves. So I work on the opposite end of that spectrum of teaching people how to be kind to themselves and give themselves grace. And yeah, I just think when you are later in your life and you get this diagnosis, it can really flip your perspective and you have to unlearn a lot of things and relearn those things. And I really love meeting women that are at that point in their life and want to just get rid of a lot of the shame that comes with this late diagnosis. And yeah, so if this is you and you want to learn more or just chat, leave a comment, DM me, go to my website, all of the things. I would love to hear from you. Yeah, Betty, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure thing. Ashmi, I know I tell you this all the time. I'm still a fan of, we're not in the business of making life harder. So definitely agree that there's a space we want to build for folks and welcome them in for. And as for me, I am Betty Chan. I'm an authenticity life coach, primarily supporting first gen code switchers. You don't necessarily have to be first gen, but it's just folks who understand what it feels like to straddle two different worlds, or the feeling of like, we show up in our week and our day as like two or more, sometimes different people for those around us, to kind of help them get back to a place where they can feel safe and put down that armor and trust that who they are already is enough to show up with, and it's more than enough to show up with, and do that with confidence as well. So similar to Ashmi, my type of coaching style is between, I would say, healing and goal achieving. It's kind of somewhere in that middle ground of that experience. And yeah, I think for me right now, I particularly love supporting my clients and how do we find success through gentleness? Because most of us are so used to the idea of success tied into that hustle and grind and are not able to see a different way for ourselves. And trust me, there is a much gentler way to go about life. So welcome, folks. And yeah, I guess to kind of just dive right into our topic today It's a title that we just love to say out loud. How do we make advice suck less? It's just such a fun one to say. And admittedly, you guys are joining a part one of what we hope to be a three-part series. And this first part, we really want to focus on avoiding advice. And before, just to kind of give a lay of the land, when Ashmi and I are talking about advice, both as our own experience, like when we get advice from each other, when we get advice from other people, when we hear our clients talking about what it's like to receive and ask for advice, there's a lot of emotions that come up with it. And as we were talking, we noticed that they kind of fall into three general categories. So the first one is the one we're going to talk about today. The folks who are like, I'm in a place, I want advice on something, but I find that I'm silencing myself. Like I'm not asking the questions. I'm not reaching out to ask people for help or advice because there's this inherent worry of like, well, what's going to come up afterwards? And we're going to talk a lot about that today. What does come afterwards? But this worry about now I got to manage everything that comes after I ask people for advice. There's a second camp of folks where we're fine. We're actually pretty fluid about asking for advice. And then we receive a piece of advice and we're like, oh no, this is not the advice I wanted to begin with. Or it's actually really great advice, but you find yourself kind of like resisting inside a little bit of like, oh, actually, I don't want to apply this advice. What do I do now? And the sensation of feeling like we're indebted to follow that advice. So that would be part two of our series around how to make advice suck less. And the last one is actually one of our favorite ones to talk about, which is when we ask for advice and we keep doing it, it almost feels like an impulse that like I can't make any decisions unless I'm asking at least 10 people what they think. My mother, my dog, my partner, everyone around us, that stranger in the bus stop. We're like, what do you think about this? Right? Before we can feel like we make those choices that we already know what to do, but we just have trouble trusting ourselves for that. So that is going to be coming up in part three of the series of how to make advice suck less. Um, let's start at the beginning, right? Because I realize sometimes when we say the word advice, we don't always mean the same thing. So I just want to start an open discussion. And for folks who are listening in, I'd love to hear your take on like, what does advice mean to you? What does it look like to you? And what does it sound like to you? Ashmi, how do you tend to define advice?
Yeah. I think for me, when I think of advice, it's something someone else thinks I should do. And it can come from a bunch of different places. It can make me feel a bunch of different ways. But I think it comes down to
Mm-hmm.
someone thinking that I should do something a certain way.
Yeah. That's why we're always resistant to advice sometimes.
Exactly. I don't like being told what to do.
Yes, and that's a wonderful thing to know about yourself. It's like if you're someone who feels that way, it's like, yeah, there is something about our experience of being told what to do from a very young age to now as an adult that like makes it very unpalatable to us. Yeah, I would say that's a general gist of like advice comes with a stigma of like, oh, now I'm being told what to do, as opposed to advice is supposed to help me. Advice is supposed to make me see more options, etc. And sometimes I notice that when folks give advice, myself, I do this sometimes too, and I have to check myself in it of like, and I know I don't want to tell someone what to do because then I know it'll come off as a type of advice of like, well, you should do X, Y, and Z. So I would frame it as a question, but sometimes it inherently still feels like it's a backhanded advice. It's like, oh, well, have you tried this already? So it implies that like you should have tried that. You should have journaled on that. You should have reflected on that. You should have not said those words to this person and so forth. So I would also categorize that as advice when it feels like that passive aggressive questioning that comes into our lives as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it feels like we're on the same page on that. So I'd love to
Yeah.
see in the comments if folks agree with us or if they have an even more elaborate way of understanding advice. But to the first part of the series today, I really wanted to spend more time with you on like that place in that moment that it feels like we want advice, but we're not asking for it because we're worried about what will come up afterwards. So this comes in a lot of different flavors and we can pull from our own lives. We've definitely seen this as coaches working with our clients as well. But I guess just to open it up for everyone. And again, if you're watching, you're welcome to answer this question along with us. But what comes up afterwards. When we don't ask, when we hold back that asking, even though we know we want some advice, what are we worried about? Like, what comes to mind?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me is as a recovering people pleaser, and I work with a lot of people pleasers as well, the idea that, oh, if I ask for advice, I'm going to have to follow whatever they say. Like there's not going to be an option for me to say no thank you, or thanks for the advice, but I thought about it and it's not going to work for me. And so knowing or feeling like you're not ready to say no to the advice, and you're just like, it's going to be easier for me to not ask for it because
Mhm.
I don't want to go through feeling obligated and having to have a confrontation, just
Mm,
all of the things that kind of come up.
yeah. To like, okay, I'm uncomfortable right now and I need to ask a question, but I'd rather stay in this discomfort than to deal with
Yeah.
that discomfort of having to then say no or feel like we're going to be in a confrontation. And I think sometimes it for what I've noticed in again also a recovering people pleaser. So this is very personal as well, but also with my clients, it's that worry of like we don't want to come off as ungrateful. Right? We
Mm.
already feel so grateful that someone has taken the time to stop in their day and answer our question. And I think it comes from a lifetime of not having people do that for us and then believing that we're not worth taking someone else's time. So when we do, and it feels like, oh my God, this person's already being such a wonderful person, taking like 5 minutes out of their day, we feel this immense gratitude already before we even get to the advice part. So it's that feeling of like, oh, if I don't take your advice and if I don't like it, am I going to appear ungrateful and worried about that perception of us as well when we're asking? That usually comes up.
Yeah, yeah. The concept of not wanting to seem ungrateful. And I think what that leads me to thinking about is also the idea of just not feeling like I want to over explain myself, right? So generally when I'm at the point where I feel like I need advice, I have ruminated or spiraled about it on my own for quite a bit of time at that point.
Yeah.
And so then if I'm asking someone for advice, I'm just too tired to want to
Mm,
explain myself over and over again.
hmm.
And I just want someone to have an answer, which I understand is not always realistic, but I do feel like on the emotion scale, that emotions and energy scale, that's where I'm at that point. And so, and also as somebody who's had undiagnosed ADHD for so long, I've just been misunderstood for a really long time, and
Mm,
the patience around being misunderstood is much shorter. So
yeah.
there's a lot of
Yeah.
times where I'm just like, I don't really feel like being misunderstood right now. And the
Hmm.
energy it would take to give someone enough context to give me the advice that would feel good
Hmm.
feels like it's going to be a really long path.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'd rather not.
Yes, that impatience that you named, like that is very recognizable because you're right. It's like and I think that same feeling of being like misunderstood regularly also shows up for code switchers, right? And especially first generation folks. And it's like there's like a built-in level of exhaustion already. We're not starting with the whole capacity of like, okay, I can take what you are going to dish at me, you're going to receive from what you want to share, from your expertise and so forth. So I think when that happens, I'm imagining a pot, right? It's like it's been on low simmer this whole time. We're trying to vet and find our own way the whole time as well. And I think often for first generation folks, we have this need of feeling like we have to figure it out. We have to exhaust all the options of trying it on our own before we can ask for help. And by the time we get there, it's like we've been slow boiling already where we're ready, the pot's ready to blow, right? It's like, unless you can give me like a fast answer and it's got to fit all my circumstances, it's not gonna sit well. And then it's gonna bring up all these feelings of like, oh, now I gotta justify, now I gotta explain. So it feels a lot more exhausting when you're actually coming to a point where you're trying to receive help. but then you gotta put out like, I gotta say no to your option. I gotta elaborate on my situation. And then we gotta figure out what actual advice helps me. That's like 3 ways of expending energy before you even get the help that you've been hoping for and been holding out for a long time. So I think it's really interesting because like it comes off as someone who's ungrateful and impatient about getting that advice, but it's like it's
Yeah.
usually that person has been so thoughtful about the process already, and there's just something they didn't say out loud. It's very clear in their head, but they just haven't said out loud to the person they're asking advice from.
Yeah, and listening to you talk about, like, the pot and it comes off as ungrateful, but it's really just somebody who's been really thoughtful for a long time. I
Mm.
think it can also come off as, "Oh, you're being defensive,"
Mhm.
and, "Oh, you're closed off to my advice, so why did you ask for it anyways?" And I and I think that also for myself, and I've seen it in other folks as well, having that experience over and over again can make you feel or can make you more aware of, I'm so fragile right now that I don't want to ask for advice because I know that I'm going to take it personally and come off as defensive. Right.
Mhm.
Just knowing that I'm not in a place to seek advice, so I'd rather just not go through the emotions that are going to come up for me if I ask.
Yeah.
And And while I do think that there's a level of that that's um, assessing the safety level of like, do I feel safe enough to ask for
Mm.
advice, which I think we'll go into. I do think that that can keep us from asking for good advice because we're not trusting ourselves to go through the emotions cycle and
Yeah.
knowing that it's okay. Like, emotions are always going to come up. And I think a lot of times in the attempt to just avoid discomfort or feelings that we don't want to feel, we just don't do things.
Mhm.
And we just
Mhm.
say, I don't really want to ask for
Yeah.
it because things are going to come up that I don't want to feel.
Yes. And your mention of like the outward appearance of like you ask for advice, but you're not receiving the advice can come off as like a sensation of like, oh, you're being defensive. Like you don't even actually want my help. Um, I've seen that show up in so many settings, right? Like when we're joining a new company and we need to ask where the files are, how do we do X, Y, how do we approach new business, how do we approach meetings, etc. And then receiving some suggestion on how to go about it that doesn't actually fit, like actually contrasts with what we hope the answer would be as well. I see it a lot. I remember experiencing it whenever I would become a new manager for someone or I received a new manager myself. It's like, okay, we got to rebuild this relationship now. You are someone I'm supposed to regularly ask for advice from. And like how do we learn about how to give good advice that will be received the way it wants to be received? And like as a person asking for advice, just checking with myself of like, am I too fragile right now to ask for advice? Is like, am I feeling a lot of feelings about what's been happening from that client meeting or from that performance review that I actually might need to just take a beat to myself rather than look like a good student or a good employee and immediately ask for feedback when I'm not actually ready for that advice or feedback.
Mm.
Um, but it shows up and like especially whenever we have like new relationships and join new settings, like it happens with new communities, like especially if you're in workplace, you're joining affinity group which doesn't really have like written rules around it. Or even for us, like we work with a lot of business owners too, so like when we join group spaces and masterminds, like how does that actually, we have to like reset all our expectations on like how to ask for advice and how to give advice as well.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. The new setting thing really resonated with me just because I think we don't always give ourselves the space and time to build that trust with others and with ourselves.
Mhm.
And
Oh,
so
yeah.
when something feels really bad at the beginning, we lean into the personal side of that instead of realizing that it might just be because we don't know their style and they don't know our style yet.
Yeah.
And I do think that a lot of people, before they build that trust, jump into advice giving
Yeah.
because giving advice from a place of expertise feels way less vulnerable than saying, "Tell me more. I don't know. I don't know what you mean. I
Mm.
don't know enough about you to tell you." All of those questions that they don't sound vulnerable, but they feel vulnerable.
Mm.
And so I think a lot of us jump into, "Oh, let me just like tell you what I think about this so that
Mm.
I come off as somebody who is confident and knows something."
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think that it's good to remember that that might be a knee jerk reaction for somebody. And it's just because it's a new relationship, not because they think you're doing everything wrong.
Yeah. I like the just like the alternative way of seeing that because it's so easy just to get mad in those moments of like, oh, I'm not understood, or like this person is being a jerk and like just trying to force feed me advice, etc. It's easy to get hung up on that. But the difficult part, like you said, it is vulnerable work. It's work that it's communication we're not taught to do in
Yes.
school or in our family. So that's why it feels really, really hard, especially when we do it in settings that are professional as well, or even romantic, right? It happens in the same way. How we communicate in one space always shows up as a pattern, how we communicate elsewhere as well. And I like the grace that you're encouraging for just like if you're in a new setting, everyone's got to relearn it. And I think that knee jerk reaction, it's pretty common for folks who need to code switch. Like you're entering a new space, that like desire to need to prove that we know and need to prove that we're an expert shows up in both how we ask for advice as well as how we receive advice. And actually, Ashmi, I want to see if this shows up for you or folks that you know as well. Like I feel like it's a condition that comes from old settings, right? And
Mm,
actually, how we want advice and then we don't ask, we find ourselves not asking for it. Sometimes it happens in old settings as well. And I mean, in like, it could be as casual as like a group chat with a bunch of your college friends. It could be happening when you're asking your parents or your siblings for advice, or for me, sometimes like asking my partner for advice. And like knowing that I want to, but I hesitate when I'm in those old settings.
yeah. Yes to all of that. It wasn't a yes, no question, but I'm just gonna say yes to all of that. Um, I think what comes up for me, and I've seen it come up for my clients a lot, where I've had to almost like regulate myself in order to be curious with them, is this one when you're in when you have like old things, or if you're in a setting that's old, there's a lot of preconceived notions that come on both sides, right? The people know you well enough to have preconceived notions, and you know them well enough to have preconceived notions about what they're going to say or what they're saying and what that means. So
Or
there's
they're
just
not
a lot
saying
of,
and they're thinking.
exactly, there's a lot of assumptions happening across the board. And and then I also think we carry what we learn from those situations into new situations. And
Mhm.
so this, this idea of being misunderstood your whole life, if you're in any sort of marginalized community, BIPOC,
Mhm.
child of immigrants, neurodivergent, all of those things, and almost having this, you call it an armor,
Mhm. Yeah, wearing armor.
and almost going into a new situation with this armor of, I know I'm going to be misunderstood,
Mm.
and so you're going to see things through that filter, and you're almost not giving yourself a fair chance to experience something new.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
definitely.
yeah, and I think it's also very natural for us to seek safety through what we know.
Mhm.
And it's much scarier to say, I'm going to go into this and let it be what it is.
Yes, that requires a lot of trust in yourself, the value that you already bring before the conversation even starts, and the trust in the partnership of the conversation of like neither of us knows where the heck this conversation is actually going to go. We only know if we keep staying in conversation with each other. But it is so challenging when we find that like, okay, I want to ask for some advice, but I notice I'm actually going to not. You're right, it does come back to feeling like we don't feel safe to show up as ourselves, and just checking like, is that a pattern that I have, or is that a result of the environment that I'm in? So if you're listening in, that's something, and if you resonate with this, that might be something to check first of like, okay, when I don't feel safe, is that just me and how I feel generally with everyone around me? Or is it something about this particular environment or relationship that I'm in? And that safety is what is understandably inspiring us to overmanage how we engage with others, because it's a form of learned self-protection from past experiences.
Yeah, and that makes me think of a question. So, like, as you were saying that, I was like, okay, so say we've asked ourselves and we've assessed the safety, and we're like, okay, I'm
Mhm.
avoiding this, but I feel safe enough to push past that and give this a fair shot.
Mhm.
Well, then what do I do? Like, then how do I
Mm.
figure out how to engage if I've decided that it's safe enough for me to engage?
Yeah. Yes, I think so. You're right. Like the first thing is just like ask yourself, like, what helps you feel safe enough to ask for what you need, right? And if it's not, seeing it as like the only choice doesn't have to be, wow, double negatives, Betty. The only other choice is is not to just stay quiet and never ask for help and have to do it all by yourself and figure it all by yourself. It might just be a matter of like, okay, I don't feel safe here, but like, who do I feel safe with? Who can I ask that I feel safe with? Is there timing? Like, when do I want to ask? What do I want to ask for? So there are different things. Sometimes when we ask for advice, we're just like, blah, help me with X, Y, and Z, which is great. We love this. Like as coaches, we love holding space for that. But not everyone knows how to hold space as a coach for it. Like your manager who's really busy and running between meetings, your friend who's had a whole day also, and then suddenly hearing what you're sharing and what you're asking for. So being specific and being honest with yourself is like, what is that thing I actually need right now? Is it advice or is it something else? And we'll talk about this. We're actually going to introduce like 4 to 5 different things that we actually need support in our next part two. But distinguishing what those are for yourself. So the who, when, and what, setting boundaries around that, using that as a form of vetting tool of like, which of these am I going to find my safety so I can ask for the help and receive the help that I'm looking for in the moment. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there other
And
things that come to mind for you, Ashmi?
yeah, I've an add on to that of so a tool I actually use with a lot of my clients is the circles of control,
Mm,
right? So it's like what you can control, what you can influence, what's out of your control.
mhm,
And I think this is a great place to think of that of because we come from a place of not wanting to manage feelings, and so we over control everything so we don't get into a situation we don't want to be in. And
mhm,
I think piecing it out can be helpful of knowing you don't even if you've known the person for a really long time and you've made a bunch of assumptions, you don't actually know how that specific conversation is going to go.
yeah, mhm,
And building the safety in yourself that you can change your mind. You can say, "Oh, never mind, I don't want advice." Or you can just say, "Thanks so much for the advice. I'm going to think about it."
mhm,
There's so many options to redirect, change course, all of the things. And
yeah,
knowing that you have those options can be really helpful so you don't feel stuck or obligated or that you have to say, sure, yes, I'm going to do that thing.
and then feel bad when we don't want to take that
Yeah,
piece of
exactly.
advice. I think that's a really good reminder, like to start off the conversation being open about where we'll go, because you're right. Even if you've had a relationship with the person, so the who checks off is someone I feel safe talking to, but the timing of it and the topic of it can change. And what you're asking for can change as well. I often find myself doing it. I'm like, I need some advice on X, Y,
Mm.
and Z. And then, like, 2 minutes in the conversation, I'm like, oh, never mind. Actually, I answered the question for myself. And like, and I think it's okay. It's okay, as you said, like to retract that request, because sometimes we don't actually know what we need until we start openly talking about it. That's when we really get to pull back the shoulda, woulda, coulda layers and actually figure out what is the thing that truly will support us in this moment.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the last thing I would suggest, wow, that feels like I'm giving advice. Or
Ah.
maybe I am. Maybe this is me giving safe advice. Is that it's normal to feel a little apprehensive if you're when you're asking for advice, and normalizing the feelings for yourself so that it's not this so it's not this expectation for it to be super transactional of I ask you for advice, you give it to me, and I follow it. There's so much more involved, as we just talked about, and normalizing that you're both going to have feelings about it and feelings are going to come up for you, and that you can navigate those as they come up for you, can
Mhm.
be really helpful to add to the safety of just asking for the
Mhm.
advice when you after you've done like the who what when and you've decided that you know what you are going to ask for.
Yeah. Yeah. So, folks, that's part one for us. Sorry, I don't mean to do like a rough stop, but like there's so much more we could say about advice and receiving and asking for it as well. And we I think at the last thing I want to leave for folks is just we can't do it all by ourselves. We shouldn't expect ourselves to do it all and like pull up by the bootstraps and figure everything out. And that it's actually a better experience when we get to do it together. And part of that experience is asking each other for advice, guidance, and opinions. So if we could find a way for advice to suck less and be honest about what we need in the moment and help each other out in providing to each other what we need, it's something that I have a hope for all of us in work, at home, and love, etc., to find a better way to communicate and connect. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you enjoyed this and you have more questions or you want to hear more, we're going to have a part 2. So follow us on LinkedIn and you'll get notifications about the next part. And yeah, as Betty mentioned, we're going to dig even deeper into the other questions that come up, as well as more just strategies and practices that can help make advice suck less.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, everyone, we will see you very soon. Thanks
Great.
for
Thanks,
joining us.
everyone. Bye.
Bye.